Who doesn't have moments from your past that make you cringe? Who hasn't said, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I wore that. I can't believe I thought that. I can't believe I did that. You ate dirt. You wanted to be a Ghostbuster. You shoplifted gum. You tried to be a white breakdancer. Plenty of liberals also want to abuse history to control the present. And last month, a scholar named James Sweet caught hell for calling them out for doing just that. He criticized the phenomenon known as presentism, which means judging everyone in the past by the standards of the present. It's the belief that people who lived 100 or 500 or 1,000 years ago really should have known better.
All right, buckle up, because what we're diving into isn't just a hot opinion. It's a flamethrower aimed directly at the core of the woke crowd. Bill Maher, a guy who spent decades waving the progressive banner, has basically looked at his old political teammates and said, yeah, you've lost it. And he's not whispering, he's shouting it through a megaphone. If you've been watching closely, you've probably noticed his tone has shifted over the last few years. This is someone who once cheered every progressive cause, celebrated every liberal victory, and gladly joined the cultural pile-ons against the so-called villains. But now, it feels like he's turned around, realized the mob is starting to resemble exactly what they claim to despise, and decided it's time to slam the brakes before we crash. And honestly, who among us hasn't had an embarrassing moment in our past? You know, the ones cringe-worthy fashion choices, bizarre childhood dreams. Yes, Mom, I really thought I'd be a Ghostbuster, maybe even sneaking a piece of gum from a store, because you thought you were some kind of rebel. We've all done dumb things. That's called being human. And before we go deeper into this, make sure you smash that subscribe button so you never miss these breakdowns and truth bombs. So when Maher calls out the absurdity of judging people from centuries ago by today's standards, a concept academics label presentism, he's not excusing bad actions, he's defending perspective. Because expecting someone from 1525 to think the same way you do with your iPhone, Wikipedia, and TikTok-driven moral clarity is laughable. But here's the catch. The woke mob doesn't trade in perspective. They deal in moral absolutism. They want to apply today's rules to people who lived in an era when even soap was considered a luxury. And the scary part is they're not just targeting historical figures, they're coming after everyone right now.
The problem is that nobody ever gets canceled for being too woke. So you can say the craziest thing, like men can have babies, and then nobody will, even though people are thinking, well, that's kind of nuts, nobody will say it. They'll just fall in line. Yeah, exactly. That's what I've always thought, men can have babies, sure. I saw a dude who was glowing yesterday. I mean, and that's the problem.
And it's totally insane.
Cowardice.
Yes, it is. It's moral cowardice, isn't it? But
it's intellectual cowardice.
But it also comes from a place of reality, that fear, because they see people around them literally getting cancelled, getting shamed and abused and hounded out of jobs. And they think, I don't want it.
Maher has been pounding on this idea. No one ever gets canceled for being too woke. You can make claims so ridiculous they sound like something cut from a Monty Python sketch, like men can have babies, and instead of challenging it, people just nod in fear because they know what happens if you even slightly question the dogma. Online mobs pile on. The media runs hit pieces, and careers are destroyed overnight. That isn't free speech, that's moral cowardice. And even worse, it's intellectual cowardice, the refusal to ask questions because you're scared of what the answers might be. Maher sees it everywhere. Professors fired for quoting offensive terms in lessons about offensive terms, comedians censoring their own material, and entire TV shows rewritten to appease the most hypersensitive corners of Twitter. We're in a cultural atmosphere where nuance isn't just overlooked, it's tracked down and eliminated on sight.
I can't count the number of stories I've either covered on the show or just read about of professors at colleges, which are supposed to be the bastions of free speech, who said something that was just an opinion.
One guy, one
different.
Professor in America, he gave a lecture for 25 years about the use of offensive language. And then some students complained about his use of offensive language in the lecture about offensive language,
Right.
and he had to lose his job. And at that point, I just felt that was peak woke insanity. He literally was lecturing about offensive language and using offensive language to illustrate it.
They have no sense of nuance. They have no sense of context. They just know certain buzzwords or certain concepts are out of limits, off limits, and since social media is just a bunch of mean girls.
And then we get to social media, and wow, if the founding fathers had Twitter, half of them would have been canceled before the ink on the Constitution even dried. What once was a digital town square has morphed into a gladiator pit where people aren't there to exchange ideas, but to publicly humiliate their opponents. The toxicity is so overwhelming it's spilling into real life, with people refusing to date someone solely because of their political affiliation. Picture it. You're on a date, everything's clicking, you're laughing and vibing, and then they ask, "So, did you vote Republican?" And suddenly, check please. That's not politics anymore, that's tribalism. Maher calls this out because he remembers what liberalism was supposed to stand for: lifting people up, respecting different viewpoints, fighting for equality without burning everything else down in the process. But in his view, the woke movement has warped that into something unrecognizable. It's no longer about improving the country, but about nitpicking mistakes, shaming people, and projecting moral superiority, while doing nothing to actually fix problems.
This is what's so obnoxious about that side of things, that just idea of we're not really lifting people up. Liberalism is about lifting people up, not catching people.
And tolerating people.
It's not about white self-loathing.
Yes.
It's about, yes, we have a horrible history in this country. Let's make it right in the ways that make sense. It's not just about catching people.
The hypocrisy is off the charts. We live in a nation that's made enormous strides over the past 70 years. Women can vote, own property, and run Fortune 500 companies. Civil rights have expanded in major ways, and barriers have been shattered in business, politics, sports, and pretty much every field. Yet the woke crowd behaves as if we're trapped in some dystopian nightmare worse than Russia or North Korea. Come on, there's no comparison between a country where you can openly criticize the president on live television without ending up in prison and a dictatorship where the wrong opinion can literally make you disappear. But they push that narrative anyway because acknowledging progress would mean admitting that some battles have already been won. And if they've actually won, then what cause would they have left to rally behind?
Oh, I think that really is kind of the center of the country. Old school liberalism, take a victory lap. You kind of won on a lot of things, but it's another funny pathology of liberals. They don't want to acknowledge progress because they somehow feel like if I acknowledge progress, well, then I'm not as authentic a progressive. It's right in your name. And that's what you're selling, progress.
So I think that's really the middle of the country. Old school liberalism deserves to take a victory lap because they actually won on a lot of issues. But here's the strange quirk of liberals. They don't want to admit progress. It's almost like they feel that if they acknowledge progress, then they're somehow less authentic as progressives. Even though the word progress is literally in the name and it's what they're supposed to be about. And then comes the Trump factor, which is where Maher really splits from the left. The nonstop efforts to take Trump down through court cases. He flat out said, "We're going to backfire." Dragging him into court over something like the Stormy Daniels case might have been satisfying for MSNBC's audience. But for much of the country, it just made him look like a political martyr.
On Donald Trump, all this legal mayhem that's flying at him, does it actually empower him? Does it have the opposite effect, perhaps, to what the Democrats would hope it would have?
Yes, well, that was the end of the show tonight when I was talking about the Stormy Daniels issue. I mean, it's always going to strike people as sex. When it's about getting a guy for sex, I don't think they should have discouraged, I guess Alvin Bragg can do what he wants. But if I was the president or somebody, I would have discouraged him quietly. Let's not do this one, because we're gonna see Trump hauled into court as we did, and that's going to be the big story, and it's going to be just high fives on MSNBC. And look, I was thrilled.
And he was right. The nonstop coverage turned Trump into the most talked about man in America all over again, and instead of ending his career, it supercharged it. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. All you end up with is a bigger blaze. Maher also loves pointing out the absurdity in Hollywood, noting how movies from just 15 years ago, made by the same liberal, woke-approved directors and actors, would now get ripped apart for not meeting today's diversity quotas. Not because the story needed it, but because the checklist requires it. At that point, it's not about genuine representation anymore. It's about box ticking and virtue signaling, and in the process, creativity gets strangled. Characters feel forced into movies to make a political statement instead of serving the story, and entire scenes exist just to scream, "Look how progressive we are," instead of actually entertaining. That's not art. That's propaganda dressed up in glossy packaging.
I'm constantly amazed when I rewatch movies from only a decade or so ago, and they were made in a way that today would get you burned at the Twitter stake. It's complicated. From 2009, to name just one of many I could choose, was made by a who's who of the most blue ribbon certified Hollywood liberals, woke approved and Democratic Party contributing, from the stars to the producers to the director. But it apparently occurred to none of them to have any kind of minority in the cast. You would need a divining rod to find a person of color within 500 feet of this movie set. But if they made it today,
And it doesn't stop with pop culture. The woke movement has even targeted some of America's most celebrated historical figures like Lincoln, Washington, Jefferson, and Teddy Roosevelt. Statues have been torn down, names stripped away, and legacies reduced to a single flaw, as if a person's entire life can be defined by the worst thing they ever did, even when that same person helped build the very freedoms people enjoy today. It's historical arrogance at its highest level, judging people from 1776 as if they were posting tweets on an iPhone in 2025.
Many liberals also want to abuse history to control the present. And last month, a scholar named James Sweet caught hell for calling them out for doing just that. He criticized a phenomenon known as presentism, which means judging everyone in the past by the standards of the present. It's the belief that people who lived 100 or 500 or 1,000 years ago really should have known better.
Maher calls that out because he knows that without historical context, you can't understand progress, and without understanding progress, you can't defend it. The truth is every nation, every culture, and every civilization has dark chapters in its past. Slavery wasn't invented in America. It existed everywhere, from the Sumerians to the Romans to African kingdoms, and yes, the early United States. Yet the woke movement talks about it as if America single-handedly came up with the idea in 1619. That's not real education. That's activism dressed up as history.
It's because we hadn't then grown into the persons we would become. And humanity writ large is just the collective version of that. Did Columbus commit atrocities? Of course. But people back then were generally atrocious. Everybody who could afford one had a slave, including people of color. The way people talk about slavery these days, you'd think it was a uniquely American thing that we invented in 1619. But slavery throughout history has been the rule, not the exception. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Romans, the Arabs, British, the early Americans, all the way up through R. Kelly.
Maher's message is straightforward. You can recognize the horrors of the past without erasing the people who built the present. You can fight for equality without crushing free speech. And you can push for change without turning the nation into a cultural battlefield. But right now, the woke movement isn't aiming for balance. They want purity tests, ideological conformity, and complete control over the cultural conversation. And Maher isn't playing along. His shift toward the center isn't about becoming a conservative. It's about saying, enough, this has gone too far. Because here's the bottom line. If fear, moral arrogance, and historical ignorance are allowed to take over, you don't just lose humor or cultural vitality. You lose the very foundation that made progress possible to begin with. And if that collapse happens, it won't matter which political team you're rooting for. We all lose. So maybe the real question isn't why Bill Maher is speaking out now, but why isn't everyone else?